can we make sense of some of the most bizarre passages in the Old Testament? Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. What on earth is happening here? Dr. Dominick Hernandez is an Old Testament professor.
For what? Why? Have to recognize that we do not know it all.
At Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. As God intends to, but his wife, Zipporah, cuts off her son's foreskin.
This passage is weird for many reasons. So
now, these questions we're going to dive into, Dominick, come from a tweet I sent out. I had both Christians and skeptics. I said, give me the most bizarre passages you want me and probably somebody more qualified than I am, an Old Testament professor, to at least try to make sense of. These are some of the ones that bubbled to the surface. So I am pumped to dive in. But first off, thanks for coming on the show for the first time.
Thank you very much for having me, Sean. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be on with you.
Well, thanks for saying so. Now, before we get into these 10 passages, I just like a little bit of your backstory. So what do you love about the Old Testament? And why did you choose to become an Old Testament professor?
Well, as many Christians would say, I love the entirety of the Bible, right? I mean, Old and New Testament alike. But generally speaking, Christians, I think, tend to default to studying the New Testament. Here we have much of the Old Testament explained, and we have the manifestation of the God-man, Jesus, the Messiah, Savior, and we have the stories in the Gospels, the narrative of what Jesus did when he was on the earth. And then we have the epistles that explain the implications of that for the early church and continue to be relevant to this very day. So it just seems right for many Christians to jump into the New Testament when they start studying the Bible. But we also believe that all of the scripture is equally inspired. Amen. And so the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, accounts for about 75% of the scriptures. And that's all as inspired as the New Testament accounts of Jesus and Jesus's words. And so my passion for becoming an Old Testament professor is really based in that. I want to help bring the Old Testament scriptures, particularly the difficult sections that we're going to be talking about today. I want to help bring them alive for a Christian audience, particularly the Christian audience that really defaults to reading the New Testament.
You know, sometimes we think about the Old Testament, New Testament, in our minds, it's like, well, it's 50-50 because there's two sections of the Bible. But you're right, 75%, when you just think of 3/4, should give all of us pause to stop and make sure, especially Christians, we're studying and reading this. Now, the moment we start to do so, we come across these bizarre passages. And by the moment, I mean, the first passage we're going to look at is in Genesis chapter 6 with the Nephilim. So right away, there's something that gives the modern reader pause, like, what on earth is going on? Now, we're going to go through these top 10, but just one more question. As an Old Testament scholar, I'm sure you still come across passages that at times you pause and you think, wait a minute, how do I make sense of this? What advice would you give for anyone, Christian or not, when coming across the kinds of passages we're looking at today, just to at least wisely approach them?
There are two things. First of all, there are two things. One relates to disposition, and the other one relates to cognition. Okay? So disposition. We have to recognize that we, as Christian people that love the Bible, that have dedicated our lives to the study of the scriptures because we believe that they manifest all that we need to know about God, we have to recognize, you got me preaching here, Sean, we have to recognize that we do not know it all. And that should facilitate a disposition of humility as we engage with the Bible. We come to this, and many of us that would say that the Bible is authoritative, we would come to the text and we recognize, we admit that we want to know what the Bible says. We want to be obedient to the words. We want the narrative of the Bible to form and to shape us and to change us, and we want to apply it. And at the same time, we have to recognize and admit that we simply do not know we simply have difficulty and we struggle through some of the passages that are there. So we have to be humble readers of the biblical text, particularly those that we would consider to be difficult. That's the first thing that relates to disposition. The second thing relates to cognition, and that is, along with some of the things that that should facilitate humility, is a simple fact that we are distant from the Old Testament
Mm,
in ways that we are not distant even from the New Testament and more contemporary literature. So just think for a second.
mm,
The New Testament is really old for us, right? It's 2,000 years old ish.
sure.
Okay. Now, let's date the historical Abraham. Now, this is not going back to any of the texts that may have been, that may have had
Sure.
sources or before. Let's just go back to a historical Abraham. It's about 20 centuries before Christ
Mm,
ish. So 2,000 years or so before Christ, maybe 19 centuries, all right? Something like that. And then you jump ahead about 500, or depending on how you date the Exodus, the historical Moses. That's another 1,500 years before Christ, or 1,400
mm,
years, or some would say 1,200 years before
sure.
Christ. That's really old, Sean. You get that? And we don't intuitively get that stuff. So when we approach the text humbly, what we do is we admit that there
Mm.
are distances that we need to bridge as much as humanly possible, but we can't always bridge it all, right?
Fair enough.
So we need to, first and foremost, in my opinion, approach the text with a disposition of humility, and then secondly, recognize, so admit, have that there are certain things that would have been intuitive, that would have been up here for the readers of these texts or the authors of these texts, that may be either
Mm.
lost or that might have to stretch in order to understand what's being written well, properly.
That's really helpful. New Testament 2,000 years ago, Moses, say another 2,000 years roughly. But those 2,000 years aren't necessarily equal, because you've got the 2,000 years, to the New Testament, and you've got all the technology of Rome with the writing and with the roads and the transportation. Even that 2,000 years goes way, way back. So just keeping that in mind, approaching the text with humility. And honestly, Dom, I've read the Book of Mormon, I've read the Quran, and sometimes I find myself reading it looking for contradictions, looking for errors. And I have to remind myself, I go, wait a minute, that's not a charitable way to read another text. That's not how I would want somebody to read my text in the Bible. So that's a reminder for all of us as we dive in. Now, these top 10 came from a few things. I sent out a tweet or a couple tweets weeks ago, and I said, what are the most bizarre passages you want an Old Testament scholar to weigh in on? Most of these come from this. You added a couple, which I think are great. And we try to get a depth where we look at Genesis, Exodus, Judges, 1 Samuel, Kings, kind of a breadth of the Old Testament. We could do a whole show on like bizarre passages just in Genesis or just in the prophets.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll do that in due time. But this is representative. And the first one got some of the most votes. And this is in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Tell us what is happening in this passage. Who are the Nephilim, and how on earth are we supposed to make sense of this bizarre passage?
So you want to spend the whole show on this one? Because we can do that. You get that, right?
For sure, I get it.
Yeah. So then the Nephilim, or the Nephilim. So there's a couple of issues that are going on here. The first thing is that this word Nephilim seems to come from the biblical Hebrew word nafal, which means he fell, or relates to falling. So here we have some have
Hmm.
immediately, just simply based upon the name, related to these Nephilim as the fallen ones or something of this nature. And then as we continue reading in the Torah, we get to Numbers chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. This is the passage in which the spies that were sent into the land by Moses were scared of the strong people of the land. And so they discouraged the people of Israel, to take possession of the land. And in that text, the spies go on to state that the people of the land are huge, right? And that there were the Nephilim were in the land, and the Nephilim were the sons of Anak. And now the phrase is a little bit confusing in Hebrew, but Anak, it's safe to say that the Nephilim are tied to Anak, and Anak, which is probably used as a proper noun here, means the word giant in Hebrew. It's related to the biblical word meaning giant. So
Okay.
it seems to suggest, or it seems like the writer is depicting the spies as suggesting that these
Hmm.
people, the Nephilim, were giants. And reading this passage alongside the Genesis 6 passage, some have come to understand the Nephilim as sort of this race of giants that came about as a result of the Bnei Elohim, the sons of God, having relations with the daughter of men, which is what we see in that Genesis 6 passage. So the reasoning goes something, or the reading goes something like this.
Okay.
The sons of God went into the daughters of men, and the Nephilim were a result of that. That is, the fallen ones that were giants or something like that, right? All right, so that's one reading. My former colleague at Southern, where you did your PhD studies, named Peter Gentry, has an interesting take on this, which I thought was interesting. I thought it was important enough to bring up here. He suggests that the Nephilim were actually not the offspring of the sons of God going into the daughters of men, but because of the fact that Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, that basically that phrase is saying the Nephilim are not a result of the sons of God going into the daughters of man. Why would the narrator make that comment saying that they were on the earth already and that they were on the earth afterwards? So they weren't a result of this weird relationship between the sons of God going into the daughter of men, but rather, this phrase sounds like an explanation indicating that the Nephilim were already there, or better stated, they weren't as a result of this weird relationship that we see happening in Genesis 6. So, in short, the Nephilim might be depicted in Genesis 6 as the offspring of this sort of weird encounter that we see between the sons of God and the daughters of man, becoming a race of giants that lived years later during the time of Moses. Or they might be depicted as this Nephilim, maybe even fallen group of people that were in the land when this weird encounter took place right before Noah came, and Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So either way, the name Nephilim relates to the biblical Hebrew to fall or something like that. And the name doesn't seem particularly flattering.
Okay, interesting. So I was reading a commentary this morning by a Jewish talk show host, but his name's Dennis Prager. You're probably familiar with him, and he has these commentaries on the Old Testament. And he is like, basically, we have no idea what this means from studying the Jewish literature. That's his take. He says, but if you just look at the story of the Old Testament, there's these Nephilim, there's these giants in Genesis 6, show up again in Numbers 13. And then in the life of David, he's fighting against Goliath, who's a giant, and beyond. And he says there's a larger narrative that's been told that ties this together. Somehow they're just meant to represent, historical issues aside, this opposition to the people of God that in one sense makes this success of Israel unlikely because they're constantly battling these giants. Narratively speaking, do you buy that idea?
Well, here's what I think. I think that you see throughout the Old Testament that there are these figures that eventually are reinterpreted in different senses, and the reinterpretation is not necessarily a bad thing. But we see the same thing happening, for example, with Melchizedek in Genesis 14, later interpreted in the Psalms, as not necessarily making reference to the historical figure, but we see an interpretation of that historical figure. We see this happening elsewhere in the Old Testament as well. And this could be one of the interpretations of the Nephilim. They eventually, someone that was a part of the Nephilim could have eventually been understood to be an oppressor of Israel or someone that was just against Israel. I mean, that's conceivable. But also remember with Goliath, that there are measurements given to how big he was. And even though those measurements aren't consistent across the versions, some would say, he was 6'9", and some would say it was 9 feet. He is depicted as, at least by the writer there, as a big dude, right? So
yeah,
would fit into the Nephilim idea that the Nephilim were really big. It also fits into the idea in Numbers chapter 13, where the author, where the spies, the 10 spies that were against going up into the land, were like, nah, they're giants. They're going to eat our kids. God says, okay, those kids that were going to be eaten, they're the ones that are going to inherit the land.
Love it. So now, before we move to the second one, I know all your students ask you, do you have a preference, or are you just like, here's 2 ways to take this, and I literally have no idea?
I actually think this is kind of, I'm a language person, so I default to sort of saying what the language says and trying to make sense of what the language says, right? I so in this case, Bnei Elohim, it seems like in every other section of the Bible refers to actual like spiritual beings,
Hmm.
right? Like Job chapters 1 and 2, right? That, I mean, there's like a divine council there. We have Bnei Elohim there. So it seems like there's this weird encounter between these in like spiritual beings, not the line of Seth. I don't think that that's the interpretation, and human and women or something like that. And this is weird stuff. This is pre-fall, right? So I'm kind of like, hey, what's happening here? I'm sorry, pre-flood. That's what I meant to say.
Gotcha.
So what's happening here? It seems that the text is suggesting that the Nephilim were already in the land prior to this happening. So
Okay.
I buy sort of this very literal, and that's at least what was being depicted there. Now we can talk about what that means in terms of Christian life, in terms of Christian thought. Like that's another discussion. But I do think that the text is saying there was some weird encounter between the sons of God and the daughters of men, and that didn't necessarily produce the Nephilim. But when this came to pass, the Nephilim were already there. They were already in the land. They were this sort of long-standing, what should we call them, group of whatever, that eventually became known as giants. Yeah. I mean, eventually became,
Okay.
and also, and they're related to Anak. So yeah, it seems that would be my take now.
Okay.
But certainly only willing to argue about this for about 30 seconds with someone.
Fair enough. Of course, there's Heiser's take that the spirits of demons come from the Nephilim. We will not explore that right now. But great, that helps us a ton. Let's move to the next one that in some ways is even a little bit more bizarre. You've got this story in Exodus chapter 4, 24 through 26, where it says God intends to kill Moses. But his wife, Zipporah, takes out a flint knife, cuts off her son's foreskin, and like touches Moses' feet with it, and God seems to back down. What on earth is happening here?
Yeah, and even sort of that with your interpretive retelling of that, I mean, it fills in some of the blanks. The point is, we got lots of blanks here, right? Like, what is this? So let's ask a couple of questions related to this. The Lord sought to put him to death, like, what, for what? Why? Right? And then Zipporah took a flint knife, like, where did she get that from? And then cut off her son's foreskin. Like, that's weird. And you're a bridegroom of blood. Remember that? Remember she says that to him?
Yeah.
Like, where does that come from? Why? What does that mean? So we'll do our best with some of these in a concise manner. Now, as you well know, we have two Exodus scholars at Talbot. You knew that, right? We have Charlie Trim and we have Dr. Carmen Imes. So Dr. Charlie Trim and Dr. Carmen Imes are both writing commentaries on Exodus right now. So they were, in major series for for scholars and for the church. So if you want to study Exodus, you can do it here. Isn't that right, Sean?
Good call.
So Dr. Imes, in particular, Dr. Imes has an interesting and digestible teaching on this passage that I recommend checking out. And so some of the things I'm about to say are based on what she had to say as well. This passage is weird for many reasons. So the major thing that we can say is that there are tons of ambiguities in this passage, and we as evangelicals that love to take the Bible, to read it, to work through it and apply it, we don't like ambiguities. But sometimes the ambiguities are intentional, and also many times what we perceive as ambiguities can be figured out in a broader context. Okay. So let's think a little bit, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue for sure. So ambiguity number one, the Lord sought to put him to death. Who are we talking about? That's ambiguous. If it's Moses, okay, then why is God putting Moses? Well, first of all, why doesn't God just say it explicitly? And if God has a problem with Moses, he could appear to him again or something like that. And if it's Moses, then why is God trying to kill Moses when Moses is in the process of following God's command to go back to Egypt, right? This is Exodus 4, which happens after Exodus 3. And in Exodus 3, God tells Moses to go back to Egypt. So what's happening? Why is he trying to kill him when he's trying to be obedient to him? And if this is one of Moses's children, Then, okay, which one? And why in the world, and this is just at the beginning of this of the passage, like why in the world would God want to kill one of Moses' children?
Hmm.
So the Lord tried to kill him. Many of our translations interpret that for us and say the Lord wanted to kill Moses. But the Hebrew doesn't say.
Mm.
The Hebrew
Wow.
says the Lord was going to kill him. That's what it says. And the him is like
Mm.
third person masculine singular, like who's the him? All right, so that's it. Zipporah takes a flint knife. She cuts
Mm.
off her son's foreskin. She throws it at Moses' feet. Now that's weird, especially for us, right? Like, well, for many reasons, but how did Zipporah know what was required of her in that moment? And how did she know how to save this person's life, him, who was at
Mm.
risk? And the question here is now, is circumcision apotropaic? That is, does it have a magical ability to
Mm.
prevent bad luck? And
Mm.
that's what it seems like to us. And why is Moses passive here? I mean, we could go through a whole bunch of why did she
Okay.
throw the foreskin at Moses' feet? Right? There's a couple of things we can go. And by the way, feet can be used as a euphemism. It probably is used
Oh,
this
wow.
way in Ruth as
Wow.
well. I'm not completely sure about this. It's
Okay.
probably as a euphemism is in Ruth, where Ruth goes and lays down at Boaz's feet or legs or something like that.
Hmm.
It can be used as a euphemism for the male private part. So, all right, and then you're a bridegroom of blood. We've talked about this. So, many of these questions are never concerning these ambiguities are never really answered for readers, but it's important to recognize a couple of things. Despite the fact that the sea might feel completely foreign to the reader,
Mm.
specifically because of like the circumcision thing, which is weird. And it even seems like an interruption in the story. We have to understand
Yeah.
scene in the greater context of the Torah's narrative. So I'm going to try to do that in a minute. You ready?
Go.
Go back to Genesis 17. Genesis 17, the Lord commands Abraham. He calls Abraham, or earlier than that, and specifically in Genesis 12,
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 17, God calls out Abraham. He called Abraham to be the forefather of the covenant community, and he calls Abraham to be circumcised along with all the males of his community. Now, as weird as that sounds, the cutting away of the foreskin was to be a sign, a physical sign
Mm-hmm.
that these men were part of the community of God. Now, by the way, we
Mm-hmm.
just talked in the last section or last passage about how things that were literal eventually became understood in maybe a spiritual sense. And we understand later in the Old Testament that circumcision became understood to be the cutting away of the flesh and the purifying of the heart. And we can talk more about that some other time. But anyway, so Moses and his family were part of this covenant community, right?
Hmm.
Or were they? That's the question. Were they part of the covenant community? Now, check this out. Moses was born to Hebrew parents. We know that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Moses was raised by a Hebrew mother. We know that. But where was Moses raised?
Hmm.
Moses was raised in the household of Pharaoh as the Pharaoh's daughter's son,
Hmm.
and flees to Egypt when he gets caught, right? He flees to Egypt and ends up with a Midianite father-in-law. So what is Moses by the time we get to Exodus chapter 4? What is he? He's
Hmm.
Hebrew, but he's also raised in the household of Pharaoh, and now he's hanging out on the backside of Midian.
Hmm.
So what is so in Exodus 3, Moses is commissioned to go by the Lord to go back to Egypt to deliver the people of Israel, his own people, but Moses, and by the way, they're the people of Israel, his own people and the covenant community of God, but Moses hasn't, and his household evidently hasn't quite fully identified with the covenant community.
Hmm.
So what's the only thing at this point that's required in order to identify as the covenant
Hmm.
community of God, the God of Israel up to this point in the Torah? What's the only thing that's recognized or that's
Hmm.
required other than belief in Yahweh as the one true God? Circumcision.
Hmm.
That's the answer. So Moses, he hadn't been active in obeying this
Hmm.
command within the context of his household. And even though God supernaturally called him to liberate the covenant community, and Moses doesn't fully identify. And so
Hmm.
this background, or at least Moses' household, right? We don't know who that
Yeah.
him was.
Sure.
So this
Hmm.
background leads to this odd scene in which Moses is passive. And interestingly, his Midianite wife is active in not only saving him and his family from death, but also now saving the people of Israel. And this fits in a theme that we see in other places in the Old Testament,
Hmm.
where these women that have origins outside of Israel are active in saving the Israelite people, like Rahab, for example, when she hid the spies, and Ruth, obviously, by way of her being
Hmm.
faithful to Naomi, Naomi's God, coming to Israel, Bethlehem, and then marrying into the people of
Hmm.
Israel and eventually being a foremother of David. So I think that's how we're
Okay.
supposed to work through this weird passage.
Totally helps. Now, the weirdness of circumcision aside, why God chose that issue aside, those are separate questions. But when we look at who Moses was, how God was using him, what it meant to be part of the community that he's building, it makes sense that he had not taken the step yet to fully identify he and his family with God as he's going to be used as a spokesman. When you look at that context, at least we can make sense of how it fits in the narrative. Super helpful. Now, this next one arguably is even weirder, and we could probably spend an hour plus just on this one. So give us some of the key highlights to make sense of this. Now, we're moving forward into the book of Numbers, chapter 5. There's this test for an unfaithful wife. Again, Numbers 5:11 through 31. What on earth is going on, and how do we make sense of this?
Yeah, this is weird. This is bizarre, right? So let's summarize. I'll do my best to do this briefly because this is like 21 verses here. So
Sure.
basically, the man suspects that his wife has been unfaithful to him. A man can bring his wife to the priest with a jealousy offering to verify whether or not she's been faithful. And then this priest makes like a concoction of water, dust from the floor of the tabernacle, and some ink, and he sets the woman before the Lord. He unbinds her hair. He places the offering in her hands. Some translations will say places her hand on the offering. Okay, now the priest does this. He has this bitter waters, and this waters are going to like bring about a curse or bring to light what the truth
Hmm.
is. So the priest then makes the woman take
Hmm.
an oath and indicating whether or not, really indicating the consequences of whether or not she's been faithful to her husband. And then, if she's been faithful to her husband, the oath indicates that the Lord would curse her. And most translations say something like her thigh would fall. Thigh might be a euphemism for female genitalia, and her
Oh,
belly would
okay.
swell. Yeah, something
Hmm.
like that. And the belly swelling is interesting because it might indicate, and we'll talk about this just in a second, but it might indicate maybe the reproductive organs not working as well,
Hmm.
right? So the belly swelling, it's not
Hmm.
just like a bloating or something like that. So anyway, the priest writes these curses in a book, wipes some of the ink off, it seems, into the concoction. And if the woman is guilty of defiling herself, the water is now going to cause her, she's going to drink it, and this water is going to cause her great pain. Her belly's going to swell, her thigh's going to fail. And if she's innocent, she's going to be clean. She's going to have the ability to reproduce. That's the idea. That's where the whole belly thing probably means something that has to do with
Okay.
reproductive organs.
Okay.
So to summarize, then at the very end of this, to summarize, the narrator seems to suggest at the very end, in verse 31, that the man who suspects his wife of infidelity is not to be punished irrespective of the outcome of the trial. Now, contemporary readers were like, dude, what is this, man? Like you can just put your wife on trial? Like, and check this out. It doesn't seem like there's the same type of accountability for men, right?
Yep.
This is just about women. And
Yep.
why, like if you married this woman, why don't you just trust her? Says,
Hmm.
many of the contemporary readers. All right, so let's just address, we can't address everything that I mentioned, but let me try to do,
Totally.
if it's as quickly as possible, to address a couple of these issues. So the first thing, it's important to recognize with regard to marriage in the context of the Torah, infidelity was a capital offense.
Hmm.
So that is between married people. Now, so we read like in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, there's a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, the one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, and the adulterer and the adulterer and the adulteress
Both.
are put to death. Yes, both of
Hmm.
them are, right? Now, in this text, we have to note that the Torah's teaching is with regard to married people, and it doesn't exclusively apply to women, but it also applies to men. So we have
Okay.
to note that the Torah contains other sections in which men are also held accountable. We have to admit it is difficult to see sometimes how men are held equally accountable. Let's just be honest. But men are indeed
Mm.
held accountable in the Torah as well for certain things. Like, for
Mm.
example, there are also situations in which women have the ability to bring charges against men. So, in the case of
Okay.
levirate marriage, which I'm sure is going to show up in this
We're coming up.
conversation, and then also Deuteronomy 22, where
Mm.
where a man violates a virgin, he's to be put to death, and not the woman. So this passage seems to exclusively hold women accountable. We have to recognize, and that makes me feel uncomfortable, to be honest with you. But
Yep.
the Torah does hold men and women responsible for sexual misconduct, though it's
Great.
difficult it's admittedly difficult to say that the emphasis is equal, but
Okay.
we do see accountability there. Now, we also have to view this weird section of the Torah in first of all, in its literary context, which we just did a little bit in context of the Torah, but also in light of
Mm.
what was going on in the ancient Near East at the time. Like, how does this play on? How does this play into what other cultures may have done or other people? Like, because this law was written to the people of Israel, and the people of Israel were ancient Near Easterners too. So how would they have maybe understood this? So if we do a little bit of reconstruction through text based upon maybe what the Israelites were understanding at this time, we don't know exactly what's going through their head,
Of
but
course.
look at the Hammurabi's law code, the Babylonian text dating to about the 18th century before Christ, and we read sections 131 and 132. And they say if a man is to bring a charge against his wife or one's wife, that she is having relations with another
Mm-hmm.
man, all right, she must take an oath, and she takes this oath, she returns to her house. The next section says if the finger is pointed, so there's an accusation, at a man's wife about another man, but she's not caught sleeping, so she's actually not caught sleeping with the man, or she's not caught in the act, check this
Okay.
out. She has to jump in a river for her husband. They're like, jump in a river? That sounds crazier than what we see in the Bible. Like, are you serious? But
Okay.
here's what we see, and this is, and again, it doesn't make it easy, but it provides context.
Okay.
We see that there was some power that would judge this woman's guilt or innocence by way of water.
Hmm.
That's the parallel here. So the
Okay.
idea of water being involved
Huh.
sounds weird to us, but there was another trial in the ancient Near East, including water, right? Now, this is still a
Hmm.
tricky case because, but the whole idea of doing something and act with water, that that was maybe we can't say expected necessarily, but there was another case in which water was used in the ancient Near East to judge whether the woman was guilty or not of adultery. Now, this is tricky because it seems like in the biblical text, one writer says this is the only case of biblical law in which a miracle is still necessary. I believe it was Milgram that said this.
Oh.
A miracle is still necessary to figure out what's going on. But
Hmm.
as exhibited through the law code of Hammurabi, it seems that actually there was probably a miracle needed to figure out what was going on there too. So
Interesting.
that
Okay.
provides a little bit of context.
Okay. Uh, Unbelievable. So
Yeah.
super helpful to say. If we just read this through modern eyes, it's jarring. But if we go back to the context, we go to the culture, we look at those outside and have some humility at the text, at least we can begin to make sense of it. So two things really quick that are helpful. And again, this raises in many ways more questions than we started with. But I appreciate that you started like, this passage is bizarre. I mean, you're an Old Testament scholar and just like, this is bizarre. Second, it holds both accountable, but also not in necessarily equal ways as we wish would happen today. That acknowledgement, I think, is fair and it's honest, and I really appreciate that. It's important for scholars to approach that. So, all right, let's move on to the next one that you hinted at, levirate marriage, which is described in Deuteronomy now 25, 5 through 10. What is it, and how on earth is this just?
All right. Well, let's start off with what is it, right? Okay, so the idea here is that if a man marries and he dies prior to having children,
Mm.
that the man's brother can then marry or have relations with the wife who did not have children, the former wife of the dead person, and raise up offspring for his dead brother.
Hmm.
Now, again, that should feel weird to most of us, right? Like in our contexts in North America, where normally it's you marry one person. If that person passes away, you may remarry, but you don't normally remarry within the family. In fact, that's sort of considered
Hmm.
weird in most of our cultures, right? Not every culture around the world, but for in our context, that's kind of like, whoa, what's happening here?
Yeah.
All right, so let's contextualize this a little bit, and if it's okay, let's just jump right to some ancient Near Eastern literature.
Okay.
There's an Assyrian law that's similar to
Hmm.
this one, and there's a Hittite law that's similar as well. And both of those laws seem to suggest that if a man dies without having offspring, it's the responsibility of the the husband's family, and there's sort of a sequence.
Okay.
It's the responsibility of the husband's family to raise up offspring for the dead person.
Hmm.
Now, what's interesting is that this is not presented as a straight command in the Torah. Now, when you have straight commands in the Bible, sometimes they're difficult to figure out too, but like thou shalt not lie, like okay, we can contextualize that, but like whatever, like don't worship other gods. Yeah, we can contextualize that. But this is
Yeah.
case law. So in case
Hmm.
law, you have scenarios played out, right? Like the one
Okay.
that we just about. You have a
Okay.
scenario played out. And in the scenario, what's interesting is that the woman in Israel is given a voice. Like literally, she's given a
Hmm.
voice. She talks in
Hmm.
the case law. And as the examples given in this context, we realize that this is, by way of the woman's words in the case law, this is a decision that the woman can make in ancient Israel. So she, by her words in this, she can hold the man, the husband's brother, accountable for not doing this. So in ancient Israel, this is an ancient Near Eastern custom. We see this, but in ancient Israel, it was practiced in such a way in which the vulnerable person here, the woman, could hold the community responsible for taking care of her. And she could point to the husband's brother and she could say, you were supposed to do this. You didn't fulfill what would have, we could say, broadly expected of you. She can take him before other people, other elders, let's say, within the city, and she can disgrace him so that his name is called, the person who had his sandal pulled off or whatever, right? Like, I guess that was a bad name back in the day. But that's how this, so again, that feels weird to
Hmm.
us because we don't live in a world, at least our, I could say our
Hmm.
world here, we live in sunny Southern California, where
Sure.
that's right. That should feel weird to us,
Hmm.
but recognize the Bible's written for us, but that particular section wasn't just written to us. It was written to
Hmm.
a community that lived in a world in which these practices were evidently way more common than in our world.
It's really interesting that there's both Assyrian and Hittite precedents for this kind of practice. That's interesting. This also, just as you were saying this, I was thinking about how different is our view of marriage. Today, it's all about finding my soulmate, being happy. I have no duty, even really to my spouse, if they don't make me happy anymore. Marriage isn't about kids. At this time, marriage is about the community. It's about the next generation. It's about your duty. I'm sure there was a romantic component to it, but that was far downstream than how we view marriage today. Would you agree with
Yeah,
that? Or like, what does this tell
absolutely.
us about marriage in the Old Testament?
Look, oh my gosh, marriage in the it's just like this is another hour. You have another hour, or
Okay.
we could talk about this. Right? But here's the thing, um, we do see that. In fact, when we talk about modern conceptions of marriage, like what does that mean? That seems to be changing a lot. But this idea of
Hmm.
finding a soulmate, marrying a soulmate, staying with a soulmate. By the way, I like that. I like
Hmm.
the fact that I was able to date my wife and that we liked each other and then loved each other. All of those things are very good,
Hmm.
and I think that she might say the same, right? But it is very clear that um, many cultures didn't and don't don't continue to share that same view
Mm,
of what marriage is. And so that is the idea of dating the soulmate and then falling in love with that person and then staying with that person. And then, especially within our context, again, this is not necessarily a good thing, staying with that person insofar as you are happy with that person or happy
mm,
with the reciprocity there. It does seem indeed that, we can talk about this lots in the Old Testament and the New Testament, not just the Old Testament, but it does seem
sure.
that concept or those ideas are way different.
That's great. Last thing, then we'll jump onto this next passage that is just as bizarre.
Are you sure you want
But
to? You sure you want to move ahead? I mean, we could talk forever about this.
oh man, I do love the topic of marriage, and I've written a lot on that. So maybe we'll do a follow up and go into depth. But it reminds me that we tend to read these passages with a certain sense of like elitism, and we're better.
Yeah.
And there are things like you said in marriage that you get to choose your spouse. Like this is wonderful, but is it possible there's things we've lost that they understood better? We at least need to approach the text with that question. It might unlock some things for us. All right, this next one, when I sent out a tweet asking people for bizarre passages, this one was all over it. Now, all I have to do is mention the book of Judges, and we could spend weeks walking through bizarre passages in Judges, but there's this account in particular in chapter 11, 29 through 40, which has to do with Jephthah, a judge, seemingly sacrificing his daughter. What on earth is going on, and how do we make sense of this?
All right. So a little bit of just very short here, a little bit of history as to what the narrative is saying. The story is very weird. Jephthah asks for help. So Jephthah is on a military has a military mission. He asks for help from the Lord, right, the
Mm,
God of Israel, to defeat the Ammonites. So that's not surprising. This is Israelite. He asked for help from the Lord. Okay, but then and this is the surprising part, he vows to offer as a burnt
mm,
offering the first thing that comes out of the doors of his house upon returning home. All right, so now, by the way, just in the text, we're kind of like, oh, that's a little bit of foreshadowing because the narrator
yes.
does not have to tell us that, right? Like, why is the narrator? It feels like putting in an abundance of information at that point. But anyway, so again, then Jephthah, he goes on, he subdues the people of Ammon. We're never told explicitly, but we understand that divine assistance was granted to Jephthah because, he did what he asked, right? So now Jephthah's got to keep his vow. So he returns home to Mitzpah, and his only child, an unnamed daughter, comes out of the house happily to greet him. And Jephthah starts to relate his sadness to her. He says, "Look, I have literally opened up my mouth. I've made a vow. I've opened up my mouth to the Lord, and now it's impossible for me to rescind on this pledge." So Jephthah's daughter, and this contributes to the weirdness, she's not informed of her father's specific vow. We don't have that in the text, but she's like, okay, keep the vow. But she knows it concerns her fate. So she just says, hey, let me go to the mountains with my companions and weep for my virginity, whatever that means. So Jephthah's like, fine. She returns to Mitzpah, and Jephthah realizes his vow. Okay, so the question here now is,
Mm,
does Jephthah sacrifice his daughter? And this, honestly, for me, is the easiest of all of them.
okay.
Absolutely, he does,
Hmm,
in my opinion.
hmm,
Now, here's why I say it's easy. It seems pretty clear that he's saying, I'm going to offer up this
hmm.
sacrifice. All right. And, but here's the thing. What we tend to do when we read the Bible, particularly with the heroes, is we tend to uh, sort of find if we read these weird passages, we try to find less weird ways to read passages that include
Yep.
people that have done good things, right?
Agreed.
Or that we might consider to be heroes.
Hmm.
And that's the exact opposite of what the book of Judges is doing. The book of Judges
Hmm.
actually wants us to realize that we have some good stuff, really told in a very selective way,
Hmm.
along with horrific stuff, right?
Hmm.
Because now we have this situation in which there's domestic violence within the context of the household, but also domestic violence in the land of Israel, like even more. There's civil war, and all right. So Jephthah defeats the Ammonites, crosses over the Jordan River. People across the Jordan River, they quarrel with him for not calling them. And so he has a civil war with them and kills 42,000 Ephraimites, people from within the context. I mean, this is what's happening in Israel at the time. There's no rest. And what we end up seeing is that Israel's caught in sort of this rapid downward spiral that facilitates these bizarre decisions by their leaders, but their leaders are flawed. And one of the points of the book of Judges is to get to the point where there might be a king in the land and everyone didn't just do what was right in their eyes. So in my opinion, what we have here is Jephthah asking the Lord for help. Evidently, even though it's not explicitly stated, the Lord grants the help. He's successful. And then he carries out this really weird vow, which would have never been required by the Lord,
right?
But it does fit right in to the book of Judges.
Okay, so minimally, he's an idiot for doing this vow. It's one thing to call it bizarre. I read it, I'm like, how stupid are you? What did he think was going to come through his door? A goat or a chicken? Like, minimally, the text is saying this guy is just a fool that God used. But second, does he need to carry out his vow once he's made it to God, or should he not have sacrificed her because human life trumps that commitment? Like we clearly see in other cases, like the Midianite women lie to protect in the early chapters of Exodus, the story with Rahab. And so in some ways, I would never want to downplay a vow to God as a vow to the supreme. But on the other hand, we already had Genesis 22, where it's like God does not want you to sacrifice your children. That is clear. So it seems to me, and maybe I'm reading into this, is that he's foolish to make the vow and foolish to carry it out because human life is at stake. This is not what God wants. And yet, in the story of Judges, God uses all these flawed, foolish, evil people to get stuff done. You agree with that, or would you push back?
Yeah, here's what I would say. Judges is filled with people doing good stuff and then making idiotic decisions, or vice versa, right? I mean, think about it. Like, the epitome of this is Samson, who's like, and I think obviously Samson is the real microcosm of the people of Israel. We see the people of Israel being used in certain ways, being called out, being supernaturally provided for, like we see actually in Jephthah's story as well. There seems to be some supernatural sort of help going on here, and then doing ridiculous things that seem to not coincide with that call. That's exactly what we also see in the history of the people of Israel. They're called out, they see the supernatural, God uses them in a unique way, but then they collectively make bad decisions. And ultimately, what this directs us to as readers is the God that uses these flawed people to carry out his very, very good purposes. I mean, that's a theme that we see through this. That makes sense. Now, just briefly, I want to make very clear that, of course, he should not have sacrificed his daughter. Like, hello, right? You know what I mean? And the Genesis 22 thing, the Akedah, that particular passage is a conversation in and of itself. But we can definitively state that the people of Israel should have been against any type of human sacrifice. It's explicitly condemned repeatedly throughout the Torah, especially as it relates to other people sacrificing their children to other gods like Molech and other gods like this. And we see this especially in the prophets as well. So in the tradition of the people of Israel, no, this should not have happened. No way.
That's great. That helps a ton, and I agree. Let's move to number 6. Now we're moving out of Judges into the next book in the Bible, 1 Samuel 1 through 9. Elkanah, who seems to be this figure that God clearly uses in the life of Samuel the prophet, has 2 wives. And the text seems to take no issue with this. In fact, in some ways you could argue it kind of holds Elkanah up as a model of somebody who's faithful. So how do we make sense of this passage?
Good question. So no, really. I mean, this is a tricky one too, right? Because you're right. Elkanah is he is depicted at the beginning of 1 Samuel, as upholding his ritual duty, his
Mm.
cultic duties. Like he is he makes a trip, and he goes to the tabernacle at the time, right? And he seems to be a person that, as we see in his conversations, brief conversations with Hannah, his wife, one of his wives, the other one is called Penina. We see him seemingly caring for her. So he seems
Mm.
we were hanging out with him as he's probably a pretty good dude. Like, what's the issue here? But he's got two wives, right? We're kind of like,
Right.
what's the deal? Well, let's try to deal with this based upon what we know, and what we know about the people of Israel in their
Okay.
context, and also what the readers of First Samuel may have been privy to, as in cultural or social
Okay.
customs and knowledge. So it seems reasonable to suggest that the books of Samuel, so First Samuel here, would have at least been, and I'm going with at least here,
Okay.
familiar with the traditions of the people of Israel, especially as they related to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the forefathers, right? Now, how many of those people that I just mentioned had multiple wives? Like, can you say, like the forefathers had multiple, you know what I mean? Like Abraham,
Yeah.
obviously,
Mm-hmm.
and but not only wives, but people that were taken and to have children with. So we have his grandson
Yep.
Jacob had
Mm-hmm.
wives in a weird ordeal, and then had two other women with which he had children. All right, that's again another conversation for another
Mm.
day. But the point is, why did Abraham take Hagar? He was her boss. He was in a position of power. He took her and he had relations with her. Why was that? It was because his wife was barren, right? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so why did Jacob take Rachel's handmaid? It was because his wife was barren.
Hmm.
Okay, so this is not explicitly stated. It's not explicitly stated that Hannah's barren, and that's why
Mm.
Penina is a wife. But now,
Interesting.
if we're the people
Hmm.
of Israel, if we're working through Samuel with sort of our social consciousness of what has happened to our forefathers, and we get to the fact that explicitly stated in the text, Elkanah loved Hannah. He provided for her a double portion, right? He loved her. He cared for her. He's
Hmm.
depicted as interacting with her, but she can't have children. So he's got lots of children with another woman. We could, oh, this might fit into that pattern that we see of people like Abraham and Jacob taking women that weren't their wives and having children with them,
Hmm.
effectively making them their wife to a certain extent. Again, that should be nuanced, but for the sake of this conversation, it could be viewed that this is what has
Hmm.
happened, what's being depicted as happening at the beginning of First Samuel. So it doesn't seem like God's like, oh yeah, that's fine, that's fine. You have two wives, because that doesn't line up with what we see earlier in the book of Genesis, the idea that there's supposed to be one man and one woman essentially forming a family unit. It doesn't line up with that part of the tradition of the people of
Hmm.
Israel, but it does line up with what the forefathers of the people of Israel ended up doing.
That's real interesting. I got one question for you to see if you process it this way. I think I wish the Old Testament sometimes was more explicit condemning polygamy, but I think it's sufficient in terms of God's design in Genesis. The first polygamist, I think it's in Genesis 4, is just this despicable human being who has two wives. That's not accidental. But then you look at the very people you talk about, whether it's Abraham or Jacob. Later we see it with David. It's very clear when they break this original covenant for marriage that this just invites discord. And in the case of David, death and division into the family. It's as if God is saying, I'm going to use flawed people in process. But when you disobey my command, it's not as explicit as in Judges. But anybody who's paying attention can see that my command is actually for a reason. Would you agree with the way that I frame that?
All right, Sean, it's like this. We sometimes, as contemporary Christian readers, love to read Romans and Galatians because Paul's like, do this, don't do this, you got to believe this, don't believe this, don't act that way. That's why, you know, Peter got in trouble. That, like, we love that, right? Because it makes for good preaching, actually. I mean, we can just say what the Bible
Yes,
says,
it
right?
does.
All right, but it's like this, Sean. We have to receive from the biblical writers the way that they wrote. And here's how
Mm,
they condemned polygamy. They told you the story. They said,
mm,
this is what happens.
mm,
Biblical writers of narrative don't always tell you what to do. They show
mm,
you what to do. That's
mm,
how they would do it. So in our contemporary setting, we want to be like, yeah, but the Bible doesn't explicitly, or it should explicitly condemn polygamy. And we're like, wait a second, have you read the implications of what happens when people are in polygamous relationships? Like, doesn't that condemn it for you? Just
mm,
just keep reading, man. Like, seriously, that's bad enough. So in all seriousness, though,
mm.
and this is something that I got from my my academic advisor. Still, I still really look up to him. Ed Greenstein, he would always say, biblical narrative shows you what to do.
I
It
love
doesn't
it.
tell you all the time. And
I love it.
only
Mm,
infrequently, on some occasions, does the narrator come out and say, God is thinking this
mm.
right now. He actually does it. He actually condemns David during the David and Bathsheba ordeal. The narrator comes forward and says, no, 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 what David did was wicked in the eyes of the Lord. But that doesn't happen frequently in
Hmm.
biblical narrative.
I love that. That is so helpful. I'm going to steal that and I'm going to intend to give you credit. But if I forget and you hear me say it, just know in the back, you're the source. Show
Well,
instead of telling is the way they communicated. Super, super helpful. All right. This next one, I'm
biblical,
really,
so you never have to give me any credit.
fair enough. We're on the same team here. This next one, I'm really curious. I get asked this all the time in apologetics. This is now in Second Kings before we move to Ezekiel 4 and this crazy passage in Ezekiel 4. In Second Kings, I'm just going to read it to you because it's
Yeah,
three
yeah.
passages. And here's what it says. So it's Second Kings chapter 2, 23 through 25. From there, Elisha went up to Bethel. And this is the CSB version.
Mm-hmm.
As he was walking up from the path, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, chanting, "Go up, Baldy! Go up, Baldy!" He turned around, looked at them, and cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then two female bears, it tells us they're female, came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the children. And then it literally says, from there Elisha went to Mount Carmel, and then he returned to Samaria. It would have been so easy for the biblical passage just not to include this and raise all the bizarre issues that it raises, but it's in there for a reason. How do we begin to make sense of this?
Yeah. What is this about Elisha cursing them in the name of the Lord, and then these bear coming out and mangling little like boys? Like, what is that? 42? Like, come on, seriously. Um, yeah. And how's that related to baldness? That's how this all starts, right? You know what I'm saying? And I'm kind of like, and you know, obviously, many a pastor have said, you know, don't curse my baldness, right? Or you know, whatever. So yeah, how is this related to baldness, and what's the connection here, and why the harsh consequences and the like? Okay, so this is a bit interesting because you're right. The biblical author could have skipped this.
Hmm.
It almost feels like you know, an addition or something like that to the story that's not necessary. Now, we're not really given a direct answer to the
Hmm.
questions that I just posed, like what's up
Hmm.
with, you know, Elisha cursing in the name of the Lord, and why the bear, and why mangling the 42 boys and the like. Um, but sometimes when short stories are told like this in biblical narratives, when we don't have adequate explanations for what's going on, it's important to remember that the readership might have
Good.
actually stood what was happening in context. So we're like, okay, how would the readership would have understood? Because we don't have an explanation. Would the readership have understood, since it's a little foreign to us? Maybe
Yeah.
if we bridge these gaps, right?
Hmm.
All right, now you still have your Bible open there with you? I trust that you
I
do.
can reopen it.
How about you just read, please, uh, the same book, Second Kings, chapter 1. So chapter 1 comes right before chapter 2,
Yep.
chapter 1, verse 8. So we're in the same context. just a chapter earlier, chapter
Okay.
1, verse 8. What does that say?
It says, they replied, a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist. He said, it's Elijah the Tishbite.
All right, so let me ask you this. Going back just one chapter in the narrative, what was Elijah? This, he was recognized as a prophet. What was Elijah's primary characteristic in that passage? Physical
Hairy
characteristic.
man.
He
Hairy
was
man.
hairy. Right.
Okay.
Okay. That was the defining characteristic of the prophet. And then we continue to read in the narrative, and by the time we get through halfway through chapter 2, the baton of prophet, as prophet, is passed from Elijah to Elisha. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
And then where does this Elisha baldness narrative come in? Right after that. So the baton is passed from Elijah to Elisha, and right after that, we have the story of these boys like, you don't have any hair. So in the context of the overall narrative, they weren't just making fun of his baldness, so pastors can't make that joke anymore. You can't be like, don't make fun of my baldness. What they were doing is that they were saying is that he has no hair. Elijah had hair. You are nothing compared to Elijah, the real prophet of God. Right? Like, you don't have hair. He had hair. Hair was tied to, it was a characteristic that was tied to him being this prophet of God, the known prophet of God. So what's probably happening here is they're saying he's nothing compared to Elijah, the real prophet. All right. And so what happens? Those boys and readers, Sean, because this was written to be read, right? So those boys and readers, what happens? They find out with the quickness that he is indeed a true prophet of the Lord God of Israel. He prays in the name of the God of Israel. He prays in the name of the Lord, right? Capital O, capital O, capital R, capital D. And bear come out of the woods, and the boys meet their fate. So I think that's probably what's going on here. The baldness thing is not like in and of itself, all right, no one likes to be dissed for their baldness. I don't like it, but it's not a reason to call bear out of the woods to attack people. What might be a reason for such a harsh consequence is if you threaten the word of God, which at that time came through the mouthpiece of God, which was the prophet. So this could be viewed as a threat upon how God was communicating with the community at that time, by way of saying that this new prophet was nothing compared to the old prophet. That's what I think might be happening there.
I appreciate that you said we're not given the answers to some of these, and we have to piece it together. We have to look. We have to try to make sense. It'd be interesting to know, this is a question of church history. Is this an issue we're bothered by in the present, or through the history of the church where people are like, yeah, I get it. This doesn't bother me. I don't know the answer to that, but would be interesting to see some kind of study done on that. Is the translation small boy the best translation of the Hebrew? Because I've heard some apologists say it could include small boys, but the language is much broader than this and could have been much more than just like, I'm picturing my 10-year-old son out there making fun of somebody getting mauled by a bear. That feels like it's a little over the top. Do you have a sense of the Hebrew that's referred there, if it's translated best in the CSB that I read?
Well, let me just look it up for you. 2 Kings 2:23. Here in this passage, we see Vayam Misham Bet. Okay, I'll just look at this and tell you real quick, looking for the words here. So it says, Vitkalsuvo Vayamru. I'm sorry. Here, I found it. It says, Unearim Ktanim Yatsu Min Ha'ir. So technically what it's saying is, Nearim refers to youth, and Ktanim refers to small in size. In most cases. Okay. So what we're seeing is small youth. So probably small boy is fine as a translation. I mean, I didn't look this up before that question. So small boys is probably a fine translation in my opinion.
Okay, really interesting. Yeah, now this raises a ton of other ethical apologetic questions we won't get into. But in some ways, the one piece that I would add is, isolated, this feels completely like overkill. If you look at the history of the nation of Israel and what is God doing, and the number of warnings that people had been given and what this is a warning for, their understanding of prophecy, the level of sin that's taking place there, God's covenant. Within that worldview and that relationship, we can begin to make sense of this. Agree?
Well, I would say, first of all, you said overkill, and I would say, well, a couple of things. So we don't, and I don't want to take what you're saying too literally. I want to be sensitive. But we don't read that the boys were killed. We read that they were mauled. That's a bit different.
Oh,
So
okay.
not completely, that doesn't sanitize this.
Okay.
But that's right. So that's one thing. The second thing is that, yeah, parents would call this like a 50-pound solution for a 2-pound problem or something like this, right? But think about this. Think about the God's media in terms of how God communicated. So initially what we see in the biblical narrative going through the Old Testament is that God communicated through an audible voice. And that audible voice was really the epitome of that audible voice was from Sinai, right? God communicated with the audible voice at Sinai. But even at Sinai, there's a change that happens in the biblical narrative. And that is Moses goes up, receives the word of God, and comes down and effectively is God's mouthpiece. Okay. So in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, you mess with God's mouthpiece, you mess with God, right? So if this reading that I'm proposing, if there's something to this, then basically they're messing with God's mouthpiece. They're saying, nothing compared to the former prophet. You're not hairy, right? You're bald. And he says, okay, Lord, boom. And we have this situation sort of like when Miriam and Aaron diss Moses, right? And they suffer the consequences for it. That feels like overkill in that passage. In this case, we also have something, I think, similar.
Very, very helpful. All right, let's shift to the prophet Ezekiel. There's this passage where he's commanded to lie on his side in chapter 4 for days and days and months, and then bake bread cooked over dung. Ton of people asked about this when I tweeted it out. Give us some context. What on earth is happening?
Yeah, this is a weird passage, right? So what's happening here? Well, Ezekiel's commanded to lay on his left side for 390 days, a day for each year of the punishment for the house of Israel. That number is a little bit confusing in the passage. Also, the numbers change within the version, so that's one textual issue. And then another 40 days for each year of the punishment for the house of Judah. What does that mean? Okay, so then while he's laying on his side, right, he's commanded to bake bread. The specific ingredients are given in case you care, over human excrement before the eyes of the people, and that was supposed to be his food as he's laying down, right? That's okay. Bake bread over human. Now, here's what happens, as you know, Sean. The prophet complains. He's like, no, I can't do that. I can't bake bread over human excrement and eat it. And because he's never been clean, this is what he's never been unclean. This is what he says. So God says, okay, then you can use the excrement of a cow instead, and that's supposed to be comforting or something like that. So what is happening here? All right. So one of the things we've been doing, and I hope that this has been helpful in the conversation, is just providing some context.
Yep.
Because sometimes when we're coming from different contexts, we're just kind of like, that's weird. But if we view some of the things, even though some of the things are still weird, some of the things that people in the Bible were told to do within that context, we say, okay, maybe that fits the context, sort of like the water thing, maybe, right? Okay. Let's just think for a second at how weird the biblical prophets were. So Hosea is supposed to marry someone that's unfaithful to him to demonstrate the unfaithfulness of the people of Israel. Like, God, could you show that in any other way, please? Like, please don't make me marry an unfaithful person, right? That's weird. How about Isaiah being commanded to walk around naked and barefoot, maybe for like 3 years? That's as weird as the 390 days on the left side, 40 days. I mean, that's weird, right? That's a pretty weird thing. Now, here's even a little bit weirder in the book of Ezekiel, very same book. Here we have Ezekiel's wife dies, and he's told, like with the particle lo, no, and then the imperfect future, you will not essentially weep for her. So maybe this is even a command, like don't weep for her. Maybe he's even being commanded by God, don't weep for your wife. That's weird, right? So understood contextual, and we could keep going and going and going, talking about how weird the prophets, Jeremiah did weird stuff, and Ezekiel did other weird stuff. So, but in the context of the prophets, the question isn't really why God commanded weird stuff because God commanded weird stuff. But rather, I think that the question is what's unique about this particular command
Okay.
in this context, right?
Okay.
Um, so and there are two weird commands that we spoke about. And these two weird commands, so the command to lay on the side and then to cook the bread over excrement, they come within in the middle of a series of symbolic commands that the Lord gives to Ezekiel. And in this sense, we're able to see that these two, especially the first one, the one of the laying on the sides, this command is to represent the prophet bearing the burden of the people. Now that's
Okay.
not uncommon, right? Prophets
Mm.
bearing the burden of the people.
Mm.
So here we have a siege is coming, and there's going to be lots of really bad things along with that siege. The prophet is to represent what's happening to the people by way of physically carrying out these acts. Now, for example, and this is, I think, what we have in the second command that we talked about, the siege is coming, and with that siege, there's going to be impurity associated with that. There's going to be a lack of necessary item that you would normally have associated with that siege. People are going to have to violate their norms in terms of what they would normally eat. That's going to be associated with the siege, right? So the prophet's called to represent this as well. So the coming siege was going to bring about tremendous scarcity of food, maybe even
Okay.
wood. So now the feces is going to have to serve as like this supplement and like burning materials.
Mm.
That's gross, but that's the reality of the people.
Mm.
The people are actually about to go through this time of extreme scarcity, really just an extreme
Mm.
everything in terms of the siege that was about to be leveled upon the city. So
Mm.
and now let's just go for a second and talk about the norms of eating. As you well know, there are these laws in the Torah that would have been part of the Jewish tradition at the time of this prophet. That this seems to be what the prophet is reacting against. He's like, no, I can't eat that way. I can't do that, right? So in this sense, the prophet is going to have to violate the norms of
Got it.
the eating norms, right? And that was seemingly what was going to happen once siege came to the city and the people
Mm.
were going to go through an intense time of lack. So what do we learn from this passage? It's really hard to be a prophet of God.
That's a great takeaway.
They were
No.
contextually, as we just look at some of the stuff the other
Mm.
people did, they were called to do weird things. So the question is,
Okay.
why that in that context?
Mm. Now, there's a whole separate conversation why God would use bizarre things in the prophets. It gets people talking. We remember it. But you're right, it just depicts what their state would be, and God is forewarning them through the prophet. So that helps in the context of Ezekiel. No, we've got two more. And these two you chose, so I'm...
The party's just getting started.
There's plenty more. We could do part 2, 3, 4 endlessly in this series.
We'll let
Now,
the public demand that. Comment if you want some more. How about that?
you know what? Comment down what other passages that we don't pick
Yeah.
here you would like us to come back and make sense of. That's a great idea, and we'll take a look at it and do a follow-up. That's awesome. I love that. Now, these last two you suggested, in part because we wanted from different books. We're going to go to Proverbs. We're going to go to Job. These are common questions that you get asked about, and one kind of surprised me. It's in Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, where it's the checklist for a good wife. That doesn't strike me as super bizarre. Tell me why you picked that one and maybe some ways we should make sense of what's going on there.
So we deal with two things when we talk about bizarre passages, right? What you and I have done for like the first 8 passages is mostly talked about the bizarreness of the passage, which has made it difficult to interpret. There are some passages that are maybe we could say less difficult in their presentation, but have led to really bizarre interpretations.
Got it. Love it.
At least in my opinion. But I'm the guest here, so I can say that, and then you can tell everybody, what you think. But in all seriousness, I think, and sometimes, I have an idea, which hopefully will turn into a book, which will be called something like, "Is there a meaning to this interpretation?" or something like that, right? Because sometimes these meanings get stuck in our cultural traditions and they get passed down. It's very difficult to discern this. Very difficult to discern this. And I think I suppose that this is what has happened with Proverbs 31. So, and I think, at least to me, to a certain extent, it's turned into a bit of a bizarre cultural interpretation. All right. So here is sort of what I'm here's
Okay.
what I mean.
Okay.
Proverbs 31 verse 10. So this poem starts at verse 10. Starting in Proverbs 31 verse 10, we have 22 verses that depict this woman. And this woman is the first line of this poem starts off by saying, Eshet Chayil Mimtza, the Eshet Chayil, who will find something like that. So the question is, what does Eshet Chayil mean? And many of our Bibles say something like woman of valor or virtuous wife. And I'm
Hmm.
like, like red flag, like
Hmm.
siren, because this phrase Eshet Chayil doesn't have to mean that.
Mm.
Uh, Chayil refers to strength. It refers to which is that's normally the word that's translated as virtuous or something like that. It refers to strength. It can refer to military strength, like soldiers. It can refer
Okay.
to wealth. It can refer. It has.
Wow.
It's pretty multifaceted in its meaning.
Hmm.
So the woman of what? Eshet means woman of. Chayil is what is it? The woman of what? Like what? And
Hmm.
culturally, this slipped in as sort of this virtuous woman or this wife of valor or something like that. And I say, pause. Not because, I mean, it's difficult to separate whether or not, there's anything in the back of my mind that's pushing this. But I want to do my best to be an exegete here. And I want to say, we have to read Proverbs 31 the way the writer of Proverbs
Hmm.
intended for us to read it. It is a poem that functions as an acrostic. At the end, it's an acrostic poem at the end of the book of Proverbs. All right, what does that mean? Acrostics, in this case, in
Hmm.
this particular case, starts off with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and ends with the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet,
Hmm.
22 characters. That's why there's 22 verses. Each verse starts off with the next character in the Hebrew alphabet. It's very clearly composed in a poetic manner. It's not composed like a checklist. It's composed as a poem. So if it's
Mm.
composed as a
Hmm.
poem, then we really need to read it as a poem. Now, it's put at the end of the book of Proverbs as well. Now, we know that Proverbs is a book of compilations, right? So we see the book of the Proverbs of Solomon in chapter 1, verse 1. We also see this in chapter 10, verse 1. But then we see in 25, 1, that Hezekiah's men had their hand in the Proverbs of Solomon. And Hezekiah came hundreds of years after Solomon.
Hmm.
Then we see in Proverbs 30, these are the words of Agur, no one who knows who that is. And
Okay.
then we see in Proverbs 31, Lemuel's mother. So we have a compilation of these proverbs, and this poem comes at the end. Now, as we examine the rhetoric of this poem, what we end up seeing is that this woman, Eshet Chayil, is the depiction of what a wise person is the depiction of the conduct of a wise person that we see consistent throughout the book of Proverbs. So what does the wise person
Mm.
do? They care for the vulnerable. What does a wise person do? They respect
Hmm.
family relationships. What does a wise person do? A wise person works hard, right? That's a don't be a sloth in the book of Proverbs. What does a wise person do? We get to the end of the book of Proverbs 31 and we see this woman fears the Lord. How many times does that show up in Proverbs? So what we end
Interesting.
up seeing in Proverbs 31 is the culmination of the call to wisdom. This poem is strategically put there to show all readers, Sean, Dominic, our wives, our children, that this is the poetic culmination of what wisdom looks like embodied.
Wow. Okay.
It's not just a checklist for a virtuous wife, right? Because, and I should say this briefly,
Wow.
that's an impossible thing. Like it's impossible to be this woman. You get that, right? Like what person can work full time, be wise, also,
Totally.
all like care for all these children and what I mean, like care for the poor at the same time. Like who does all of this? It's not a checklist, but we're seeing now the culmination of wisdom. Yes, this is the apex right here.
Oh, that is so helpful. Now, is it fair to say that sometimes wisdom is described as a she, kind of in the feminine, and it's just there's a way of using she to describe this deeper wisdom that, of course, would apply to all human beings. Is that in part what's taking place here? So it's not really man or woman, husband or wife. It's just here's a representative of what this whole book has been about.
Now, Sean, you got me going deeper. So here goes nothing. So,
Okay.
and by the way, I'm gonna book name drop. I talk about this extensively in my book, Proverbs: Pathways to Wisdom, in chapter 4.
Oh, great.
And yeah, yeah. So that was a book name drop. But anyway, in all seriousness, though, I talk about this chapter, and what I do in that book is I try to make rhetorical connections to how wisdom is depicted earlier in the book. I think we see wisdom
Mm.
foreshadowed in a couple of things, but yes,
Mm-hmm.
wisdom is indeed foreshadowed as a woman. For example, in Proverbs chapters 1 through 9, we see repeatedly this cycle of this supposed, like, this is the way the Proverbs are told, right? They're not told in a literal sense of a father talking to a son, but rather this is a rhetorical strategy to get the readers to embrace wisdom. This was common also in the ancient Near East. We see this in, for example, the instructions to Shulpak and other things. But the point is, we see the father saying, my son, don't go with that woman, right? And then we
Mm-hmm.
see the call of wisdom. Woman, wisdom is a woman there, right? Like, so we're not talking about literal women here. We're talking about these women, which also have the same, very similar metaphorical meaning to this whole pathway imagery. Go down this path. Don't go down this path. We understand that intuitively as
Wow.
contemporary readers. But also another metaphor that's used is dine with this woman, Lady Wisdom. Don't dine with that woman because she leads to destruction. And in this, we have Lady Wisdom, Lady Folly, the pathway to wisdom, the pathway to folly, or fear of the Lord, not fearing the Lord. I mean, that's
Mm.
depicted. And so, yeah. And then there are other things, there are other rhetorical connections, which again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because you see I'm getting pumped up already, but there are other rhetorical connections that we can see in Proverbs 31 that help us understand that the author of this composite book, now at the end of the book, is making rhetorical allusions to how wisdom was depicted in other areas. For example, calling
Mm.
wisdom precious jewels. We see
Got it.
precious jewels show up in Proverbs 31. The woman is more valuable than precious jewels.
Mm.
Well, where does that come from? It comes from earlier in the book of Proverbs. Wisdom is like precious jewels, more valuable than
Man,
precious.
I love it. I went through Talbot. I've studied a lot of this stuff, but have not heard it the way you described it until reading your book. And you talk a little bit about this and engage in the Old Testament, and hearing you respond here is just, that is so interesting and helpful. Now, we committed to 10. We're way over in time. Do you have time for one more, my friend?
I have time for one more. I
All
got
right.
time
Now,
for 10 more, but whatever.
we'll do that next time. And again, comment below if there's passages you want us to make some sense of. Now, the last one you also suggested, which I did not see coming, have not heard some of the interpretations around this, in Job 42, 6 through 7, it sure seems to suggest that Job repents. And yet you're asking the question, at least there's some interpretations that question whether he did. What is going on and why does this matter?
All right. This does matter. So let me tell
Okay.
you why this matters. All right. And by the way, yeah, this is, I will say this fits into the Proverbs 31 category, in my opinion. I think that this is a little bit less culturally oriented, I think, than the Proverbs 31 one, but I do think it's an interpretation that has been accepted and sort of passed down. Now, I don't think it's been uncritically passed down. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I think there's reason to question it. So let's jump
Okay.
into this. Talking a little bit about the book of Job. Job suffers, as it's pretty obvious that Job suffers throughout the poetic sections of the book of Job, where he's engaging with his friends. He suffers for no reason of his own, but Job doesn't know that. Job's friends don't know that. Only
Mm,
readers know that, right? We're the only ones that know
mm,
that. Job never figures out why he suffers, but he does try to deal with it. What does he do? Chapter 3, he curses the day of his birth. He wishes he was never born, but since he was born, he wishes he would have died upon his mother's
mm,
knees receiving it. But since he didn't die, he'd rather just die now. Now, he's not suicidal, but he would rather not be alive. He'd rather be in Sheol, where this is Job's take on this. Like, he'd just rather be with where everyone's sort of at rest. That's his take. So his friends are like, whoa, that's a little too much here, right? Because they sat silently with him for a week before they said anything to him. So his first three friends, um, Eliphaz, Bildad, and I'm sorry, I said Eliphaz. He doesn't show up till later. Elihu, Bildad, and Zophar. They're like, wait a second, Job, and they say, hey, let's make sense of this. And according to how they make sense of things, they say there's a system of just retribution at play. If you completely followed God the right way, everything would be going okay for you. But since we see these consequences in your life that tradition suggests, you know, fall upon the people that are wicked, that means there's probably something going on in your life. In short, that's the first round of speeches. Job fervently denies that. And even though Job seems to agree with some sort of system of just retribution, he doesn't think there's any sort of retribution coming upon him that brings about what he's experimenting. So he eventually, by the time we get to chapter 9, he's calling God an unjust judge. He says in chapter 9, verses 20 to 24, he said, God covers the eyes of judges. Now, I'm kind of like, whoa, Job, like Job is the only one, or like Job doesn't know what's going on. We're the only ones that know what's going on, but right. Job is really going, whoa. Job's friends now say, okay, if you don't believe in our system of just retribution, that means you're wicked. And so in the second round of speeches, they really accuse him of being wicked. So you're like maybe thinking, Sean, what does this have to do with the whole repentance thing? How the book of Job is generally interpreted is that we get to the end of the book, God shows up and God, does this finger waving thing at Job. And then Job's like, oh,
yep,
I'm sorry. And you fill in the blank for whatever he's saying sorry about. And that's why he gets his stuff back. And basically, if that's the case, then Job's friends were right. Because all he had to do was say sorry, and he gets his stuff back. He can manipulate the system of just retribution. So what do I think is actually happening in these notoriously difficult verses, Job 42, verses 6 and 7? Job does seem to be humbled in Job 40, where he puts his mouth over his hand. He says he spoke, but Job's questions are never answered. So when Job summons God, says, God, appear, like if you just appear right now. So God appears, and God answers nothing that Job asks about. So Job finally gets to the point in 42:6 where he says, Nichamti al afar ve'efer, right? So people are like, whoa, he says, I'm repenting, right? No. Actually, there's a couple of things. Let me go back just for one sec.
Okay.
Specifically, if I could just pull up these verses real quick, I'll tell you, Job 42:6. I'll be more specific here. Job says, Al ken, normally translated therefore, em as. Now, many translations translate em as as I despise myself. But you know what? Myself is not there. That's interpretive. The word is em as. It just means I despise. And then he says, Venichamti, which means something like I repent. But this word nichamti is also used for God. And God doesn't say sorry like, oh, my bad. That's not how God does express sadness about situations. And I think that's what's happening here in Job. He's expressing sadness about his situation. Nichamti al afar ve'efer. Afar ve'efer is normally dust and ashes or something like that. But if you look at Genesis chapter 18, Abraham uses this phrase to say that he is just afar ve'efer. He's just a human being. So what I think that Job is actually saying is that after all this has happened to him, he gets no response for anything about what he's asked for. He is sorry about the human condition. This is the human condition.
Oh,
and
wow.
Yes, and that's how Job words essentially end. And then we end up seeing that God has won, if we put it in those terms, the divine dispute. This dispute that happened in the first 2 chapters, Job doesn't say, oh, my bad, I'm sorry, give me all my stuff back. But Job stays to a certain extent, we could even say maybe defiant to a certain extent, to the very end. He does say, I shouldn't have spoke, but he says, this is the human condition. And then what do we see?
Wow.
The narrator jumps in again and says, this is how God restored Job. Narrator doesn't say, oh, Job repented and therefore he got all his stuff back. but God restores. Just like God permitted these terrible things to come to pass in the life of Job, so God also restores. That's what we get at the end.
So on this take, the point is about God's sovereignty more than it is about how we can affect or not affect justice. Is that fair?
Well, here's what I will say. The short answer to that is I would say yes. Okay,
Okay.
yes. But
Okay.
here's what I would say. I, I, as I talk through this, Christians do tend to bring up the sovereignty of God in part of the conversation, and obviously, I believe in the sovereignty of God, and so okay. But what I think is important for Christians to understand in their reading here is that, and this is the most applicable part to our daily lives, is that we actually we are not fully in control of any particular system of just retribution. So this plays out. I'll just tell you why I'm saying why I want to take the conversation that way. This plays out practically in the life of Christians, in that we have certain very explicit theologies saying if you do the right thing, you'll get the right thing.
Yep.
Right? We call some of these prosperity theologies or whatever.
Yep.
But there's also, and they normally default to wisdom literature in the Bible, or the wisdom like Proverbs and maybe even some of Job at the end.
Okay.
But also sometimes we would, like, some of us would be like, nah, like I don't agree with the prosperity theology. Like, forget about that. But functionally, we live like prosperity theologians. And we think like, wait, God, wait, what did I do to what did I do to deserve this? Like, what do I got to do to turn this around? You know what I mean? And in many cases, it's something like, hey, you don't know what's going on. Like, there was a divine contest that Job knew nothing about. So what's he apologizing for? And actually, we run into a major issue here, and this is probably the biggest exegetical issue. God then tells Job to go sacrifice for his friends. And we're like, so, and God says, you didn't speak what was right about me or rightly about me like my servant Job. And we're like, as readers, we're like, oh my gosh, like, have you, God, you know what Job just said. And what we end up seeing is that Job speaks from a position of integrity, even though the things that he was saying weren't empirically correct. But his friends, they want to utilize God in a system of just retribution that will give them what they want from God. So Job speaks rightly. Job's friends speak wrongly.
I have a million questions for you about this. There are so many shows we could just do unpacking Job to bring some clarity. Now, I know you have a chapter on that book, in your book, Engaging the Old Testament, which also was one of the most interesting to me. But here's a few. Yep, there it is. Boom. There, it's excellent. I think you did a great job with it. Here's some of my big takeaways from this. Number one, we've got to go back to the context. Sometimes there's culture. Sometimes there's language. There's a time gap, a chronological gap. Sometimes we just don't know what's going on, and we have to speculate, but try to do it wisely, make informed guesses. We have to be careful just simply adopting tradition that's been passed down, because that's the way it's always been interpreted if that doesn't match up with the text. But it's also okay to admit, because there are some really bizarre passages in the Old Testament. We don't lose anything. In fact, we gain by admitting that this is bizarre to us as modern readers. So, final question. Do you have any other advice you would give to people when they come across other bizarre passages, just to read it well?
You know, actually, this is what I would suggest when people come across bizarre passages. I would suggest keep reading, because we tend to discern what we don't know in light of what we do know. And there's lots of there are a lot of very clear passages that reveal to us the nature of God, the great nature of God, like the goodness of God, the awesomeness of God, the characteristics of God. And we should interpret the things that we don't know about God in light of the things that we do know about who God is and how he has worked among humankind, the good things that he's done. And so what we need to do when we encounter these difficult problems is not necessarily become myopic and just focus on these problems. We need to keep reading. You know, Sean, this is why we read the Old Testament and the Bible over it, just the whole Bible over and over and over again, is we actually do think that we can become better readers, and that as we read, not only we'll get more information. That's bound to happen. Anybody can read, but we actually believe that as we continue to read and become better readers, that the word will become more alive to us, and that we able to
Amen.
apply it there, because we will be able to better understand the character of God as it is revealed in the scriptures, and try to imitate him.
I love it. I want my viewers to think about it. Imagine taking full classes with you on this. We spent about 90 minutes unpacking these, which is longer than my typical video, but there's so much here. Imagine taking full classes with Dominick, where you spend days working through these, and some of the other professors at Talbot. We would love to come train you. Now, final question. Tell us a little about Talbot en Español.
I love it. Talbot en Español. Bueno, en español, me llamo Dominick Hernandez, soy profesor de Antiguo Testamento aquí en Talbot, que es de la Universidad de Biola, pero también me desempeño como el director de programa hispano aquí, que se llama Talbot en Español. Nosotros vamos a arrancar con cursos a nivel posgrado ya el próximo semestre, así que se puede aplicar ahora mismo, hoy mismo se puede aplicar en nuestra página de web, que es biola.edu, Talbot en Español. Nosotros vamos a estar ofreciendo cursos de Antiguo Testamento, Nuevo Testamento, hermenéutica, idiomas bíblicos y todo a nivel posgrado. Así que si tienes alguna pregunta, se puede poner en contacto conmigo, y yo con mucho gusto les animo a que se registren, que apliquen, que se pongan en contacto conmigo. Talbot en Español. Talbot habla español. Talbot en Español.
And just for the record, that was entirely in one breath that you did that. Very impressive. So well done.
Hey, Talbot en Español, just for all the other listeners, is a relatively new initiative. We're just getting off the ground, but we're offering courses at a postgraduate level. So all of these courses that we're offering will be accepted into any of Talbot's master's degree programs.
Nice.
We're offering at the very beginning the core courses that can then go into the programs that we would eventually offer. And also, it's important to note that these courses, and I'll say this again in Spanish very briefly, these courses are offered at a very reasonable price, even though they're at the same postgraduate level that any of the courses that we would offer at Talbot. So quiero decir que estos cursos se va a ofrecer a un precio reducido, un precio razonable, así que póngase en contacto con nosotros para obtener más información.
Love it. Fantastic. I hope we get a bunch of people dialed up, and we will have you back. Again, leave some comments if there's other passages you want us to talk about, or things in the Old Testament that you've always wondered about. In due time, we'd love to cover it as well. Dominick, this was super fun. Appreciate your energy, your insights. Again, hope folks will pick up your book, Engage in the Old Testament, and make sure you hit subscribe here. We've got some other videos on all sorts related to the Bible and culture and worldviews coming up. Hit subscribe. Don't miss ones that are coming in the future. Dominick, thanks for coming on, my friend.
Thank you, Sean.
Gracias. Adios.
Amen.